Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Shaumik Ghosh, Assistant Editor at ET CISO, and I'm really excited to moderate today's discussion on navigating the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. We're going to be discussing the opportunities, challenges, and solutions for ITDMs in India Inc. It's been 5 years since the Sri Krishna Committee submitted its report on India's first privacy and data protection law. After a fair bit of back and forth, the DPDP bill finally became an act in the second week of August 2023. So why is it so significant for IT leaders? Well, the DPDP is all-inclusive. It covers the entire data lifecycle. It pertains to data principals, data fiduciaries, and data processors. Also, the financial penalties that are defined by the DPDP Act are greater than the country has ever seen before. 250 crore rupees for failing to take adequate cybersecurity measures. Well, I hope that got your attention. Well, let's dive straight into the topic. And today, joining me is Vinaya Sathyanarayana. He's the Senior Director of the Product Management Group at SEQRITE. Vinaya is responsible for the data privacy and zero trust product portfolio at SEQRITE. Vinaya, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a great honor to host you.
Thank you, Shaumik. It's my pleasure to be here and to address this wonderful audience.
Great. Thank you for that. Well, Vinaya has got over 2 decades of experience in cybersecurity, governance, risk, and compliance. So the folks joining us today, I would request you to take full use of this opportunity and pose all the questions that you have around the DPDP Act, and Vinaya would be happy to address them for you. We are also going to be providing you a link with an e-guide to the DPDP Act compliance, which we're going to be sharing at the end of the webinar. So do stick on. With that, let me hand it over to Vinaya. Vinaya, go ahead, please.
So thank you again, Shaumik, for this wonderful opportunity to actually talk about the Digital Personal Data Protection Act, opportunities, challenges, and solutions that can actually help our audience that's part of this webinar today to navigate the landscape of this act. I'd also like to thank the audience for taking time off their busy schedule today and attending this webinar. So please feel free to ask me any question. I will try to address that at the end of the webinar. So in fact, I think probably what's keeping everybody awake at night, pretty much enterprises of all sizes, small, medium, and large, is the speed at which the Digital Personal Data Protection Act was passed, both in the lower house and the upper house of the parliament. And that's, like I said, really keeping everybody on their toes, because the deadline for complying with the Act is also probably just around the corner, and we'll get to hear all the details from the Data Protection Board shortly. But what we strongly believe at SEQRITE is that the Data Protection Act, or the DPDP Act as we call it, is actually a step in the right direction in India's data protection and data privacy journey. And I think it's been pending for too long, and we're really glad that the Act has seen the light of day. So in today's webinar, here's the agenda that I plan to cover. We look at the journey so far of the DPDP Act. So the key definitions, because it's important to understand the fundamentals of the Act, right? What are the key entities involved? And then what are the key challenges that each of these entities faces? We'll then take a look at the stakeholders and roles. What are the rights and obligations of the stakeholders and roles? And you'll see some surprising things popping up here. Also taking a look at key principles for data fiduciaries, because I'm sure that a lot of our audience today are actually data fiduciaries or data processors, and there are some good principles here. We'll then take a pivot and look at how SEQRITE can actually help you navigate all the nuances of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act through our product portfolio of SEQRITE HawkScan. I'll talk about some of the key features of HawkScan and how it can actually get you started on this journey towards privacy compliance. And then we'll open up the chat for questions and answers. Right. So just to get things kickstarted, we had this really important poll question in mind, just to understand, where you are today from a privacy compliance perspective. Let's say if you had to do a self-assessment in your enterprise today, how would you actually rate your organization vis-a-vis the provisions of the Digital Personal Data Protection Act of India? And what you have seen in our customer base at SEQRITE is that, generally they fall into one of these 3 buckets. typically you have somebody who's already being compliant with GDPR or other global privacy regulations. So they already have mature processes, systems, and tools in place. Or you also have a set of enterprises where they've just gotten started, but they're looking to improve. And somebody who's just getting just started on this journey, and they would actually like to understand all of the processes, systems, and tools that have to be implemented in this journey. So please go ahead and make your choice.
Thank you for that, Vinaya. That looks like a very interesting agenda. Thanks for the outline that you just painted for us. And a very pertinent poll question to start with. All right. So we've got 42% of the audience saying that they rate it at a medium level. And 30% are saying they're just getting started. And only 27% rates it high. Are these in line with what you expected to see?
It definitely is. And it's also, one of the reasons why we had this question on the poll. Because if you see the numbers, literally about, 3/4 of the audience are saying that, either we have just started on this journey or we probably have progressed a little bit with some few processes, systems, and tools in place. But definitely, not at a very mature level. So definitely in line with what we see in the market and our own customer base today.
All right, makes sense. Thanks for that. Well, that served as a good dip check into where the audience sees itself, and it further reinforces the topics that we had outlined in the agenda today. So moving forward, Vinaya, go ahead, please.
I think this is something probably a lot of our audience would be familiar with, the entire journey of the DPDP Act itself. In fact, which actually started way back, earlier than 2017. But August 2017 was a kind of a fundamental landmark for us, because that's when the Supreme Court said that, the right to privacy is a fundamental right. This was a huge stepping stone, because what it meant is end consumers, that is individuals such as yourself and myself, we are actually, in charge of our own data and what enterprises can do with that data. So the right to privacy over my own data became a fundamental right. And then you had this entire journey where, the Personal Data Protection Bill was first introduced in the lower house of Parliament in December 2019. And from there, it actually went through several iterations. But in 2022 of August, the government actually suddenly withdrew the Data Protection Bill. But then a few months later, they tabled a revised version of it. And then with, I'll probably say lightning speed, the bill actually passed both through the lower house and the upper house of Parliament in August of this year. And then it actually became an act on 11th of August. You can actually see that, the speed at which the act has been passed has been exceptional. And in fact, what we are also seeing is that after the act has been passed, there is a continuous stream of news about the Privacy Act itself. In terms of the Data Protection Board of India will be constituted very shortly. And then they'll start actually setting up specific, providing more details about every section of the act. And then what are the timelines? What do you need to do to be compliant? So we expect that all of this information will be, out in a few months from now. But more importantly, like I said earlier, what's important is that for us to understand what are the key definitions that you would find in the act, and then what are the key challenges around some of these areas. Starting with, let's look at the concept of a data principle, probably the most important element in the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. Now, a data principle is an individual to whom personal data relates. So that's what the Act says. And then when we say personal data, it's actually, specific data that can help you identify an individual either directly or indirectly. So you can actually make a direct inference or even an indirect inference, but you would be able to pinpoint a specific individual who is the data principal. And that data point becomes personal data. And this could include things like your name, address, date of birth, biometric data, financial information, and so on. There's also a category of data that we call as personally identifiable information, which means it's an indirect reference to an individual. So using that identifiable information, you can actually correlate multiple data sets and actually pinpoint a specific individual. So even that becomes personal data. But what we don't see in the Act today is that unlike, CCPA or GDPR, where you have, additional categories of data called sensitive personal data or critical personal data, the Act does not, go deeper into this. But we strongly believe that over the next few months, as these concepts become, more concrete, we definitely will see more categories of personal data being introduced. Now that we have covered the data principle and the concept of personal data, let's look at what is a data fiduciary. Now, data fiduciary is any person or enterprise who actually determines the purpose and means of processing the personal data. They're also responsible for safeguarding this personal data. And that means, if let's say I'm an e-commerce player and actually I'm collecting personal data about my customers, which is the core of my business, right? Then I'm a data fiduciary. And now if in turn I actually sublet this data to a different data processor, as they call it, or a different organization, for example, let's say I tie up with a third party shipping provider, which means I have to also share personal data about a customer with a third party organization who's part of my supply chain. So then that becomes a data processor. So what you'll see here is that it's not just you who is being covered, the entire supply chain, whether it's upstream or downstream, right? Whether you receive the data or you pass on the data to a different processor. So you're all part of that ecosystem and you need to be compliant with the Digital Personal Data Protection Act. So that's extremely important. And processing in turn can mean, a lot of things. For example, operations can include collection, storage, retrieval, use, sharing, disclosure, and more. And what you'll typically see in today's world is that, a lot of enterprises have actually not thought about any of this. So far, it's been business as usual because we did not have anything called as a Privacy Act. But suddenly, with the passage of the DPDP Act, all of these elements become important for you to identify in your own business ecosystem. So that's probably the first starting point. And that's also where we see a lot of confusion because even your own employee data itself is personal data, right? Although you may not be processing data about end consumers and so on, you could even be a B2B business, but your own employee data becomes personal data, and that's covered under the Act as well. Now, coming to the stakeholders and roles, again, you'll see the same elements here: a data principal, a data fiduciary, a data processor, a consent manager, and the data protection board. So the data protection board is probably, at the highest level because it's constituted by the government of India. And it's also the regulatory body enforcing the DPDP Act, right? So we believe that, within the next few days, the data protection board should be in place. And then we'll start see more and more guidelines about the Act. But otherwise, data principal, data fiduciary, data processor, and the consent manager, these are the 4 roles that you as a business have to contend with. Now, data principal, like I said, is the individual who suddenly has data rights. Now, this is extremely important because what we have seen with GDPR and CCPA is that you have all of these automated bots which actually send subject rights requests. Literally hundreds of thousands of such requests are flooding every enterprise today. And, when the Act becomes more clear and says that you have to actually process or act upon these requests within, say, 30 days or 45 days, then how do you actually do all of this, right? That becomes a big problem for your business as well as a key challenge. You cannot do this manually because to begin with, you have no idea where personal data is being stored in your data landscape. It could be on an endpoint. It could be in some structured database. It could be in a file share. It could be anywhere, right? Somebody is sharing this data over a Teams channel, right? So that way, you literally have to identify what are the points in your enterprise where such data is being stored and processed. And then, like I said, data principals are suddenly empowered with the right to access, correct, erase data. They have the right to file grievances. They have the right to nominate as well. Right? I, as a data principal, can nominate somebody on my behalf so that if I am no more, then my nominee can actually ask you to, delete my data or edit the data and so on. Right? So all of the fundamental rights are now with the data principal, which becomes a huge compliance burden for the business. Because if you don't know where this person's data is stored, then you pretty much cannot do anything else about the Act, right? And like I said, in the data fiduciary, you see the same challenges because you have to first figure out what data is being stored, what is the purpose for which it is being stored, how long are you storing it, are you actually storing the data beyond the original intent of the data, right? For example, if I'm doing a know your customer check, then how long should I keep that data? Should I keep it for 6 months, 1 year? And then have you actually obtained consent from the data principal? Which I think will also be a huge challenge for all businesses because, I don't think we obtain consent apart from the standard privacy policy or cookie policies today. But now with the DPDP Act, you actually have to ask very specific and informed consent from the data principal about every data that you're collecting about them. And then you also have to ensure security of the personal data, which means you need to invest in more tools, systems, and processes. You have to conduct data privacy impact assessments. How do you get started with that? And then let's say if somebody were to complain or lodge a complaint with the data protection board about your enterprise, how are you actually going to deal with that? The same challenge also carry over to the data processor, because the data fiduciary ultimately is responsible for the personal data of the customer, whether it's being processed by one or more data processors. So how do you ensure that all the third parties you're dealing with are actually processing the data in a safe manner? And then, like I said, the consent management is also a key piece, because that's probably the first touch point for the data principle. So it doesn't matter which stakeholder or role that you're in, data fiduciary, data processor, or a consent manager, there are key challenges in each of these roles. So that said, I think it's a very interesting question to come up here in terms of the poll. So we are actually asking you, has your organization appointed a data protection officer? Because one key challenge we see is that with the bill suddenly being passed into an act, a lot of enterprises have actually not budgeted for this. So are you planning to onboard a DPO role within the next 3 months, within the next 6 months? Or will you just make your CISO or CIO also be the DPO of your enterprise? I think the results are going to be very interesting here.
Sure, let's quickly launch the poll. And I'm just as keen to see what the results are. All right, we see the questions beginning to come in. Suresh is asking, can we get a recording of the session? He just joined in between the session. Not a problem, Suresh. This webinar is going to be available on demand. You can check it out on the EDCIO site and the ET CISO site. You can access this webinar on demand. I'll also quickly take Anjali Agarwal's question. So Anjali has a very basic question with respect to the definition of personal data. Now she says personal data definition seems very wide, and what is exactly considered to be personal data, and what does it comprise of? If you could just establish that for her, Vinaya.
Sure. I think that's a great question. It also points out to the fundamental challenges enterprises are facing today. Because suddenly now we are talking about personal data. What does that actually mean, right? So what we say is that personal data is any piece of information that can actually help you uniquely identify a data principle. For example, it need not be just name, email address, biometric data, and so on. It could actually be even your, let's say, tracking cookies that are embedded. Because every individual has a unique cookie, right? When they visit a website or your e-commerce store or your online business, and you're actually tracking that individual with that cookie ID. Even the cookie ID becomes personal data, because you can actually uniquely identify an individual with that. IP address, all of these are actually personal data, although we don't tend to think of it on a daily basis, right? You'd be surprised how broad the definition of personal data is, like you rightly said. But
Right.
what you'll also
Now,
see later,
go ahead, please.
Sorry, just completing the point. What you also see later is that with SEQRITE's HawkScan, which is our data privacy software, all of these are actually built into the product for you.
Understood. Thanks for that.
Right.
Well, the poll results are right there. Over 50% of the audience says that, our CISO or CIO will also be our DPO. What's your personal opinion about this? When should organizations appoint a DPO solely in charge of data protection, or is it something that the CIO or the CISO can take care of?
So the results are not surprising, because that's probably the most logical step for more enterprises, right? So if you have a CISO or a CIO within your organization, they probably are the best candidates to become a data protection officer, right? Because they're also well versed with other regulatory compliances. But we also strongly feel that, going forward, you have to uniquely or, distinguish between these roles, because ultimately the data protection office that you appoint will also be responsible for reporting to the Central Data Protection Board. So it makes sense to actually segregate the roles, because we see that, the DPO role going forward is going to be so busy and so occupied with all of the data privacy, compliance requirements, that you'll simply not be able to do justice to either role, if you're doing it on a shared basis. So we, encourage enterprises to actually look forward to having a separate DPO role.
Understood. I'll also address Rahul's question right here. So Rahul's asking, can a DPO be an external resource, or can a DPO be a part-time role?
A great question. Again, like I said, right? So going forward, the DPO will be probably so busy managing privacy aspects, it cannot be fulfilled by a part-time role. It has to be a full-time role.
All right.
Because that's when the seriousness about privacy comes in. And then let's say if you need to interact with the government's data protection board, and then you also have to participate in various industry sessions and so on, right? As the act becomes more and more granular, you will definitely need a full-time DPO.
Understood. I'll take another, very fundamental question, because that would, assist in our audience getting the concepts in the, slides that are to follow. So we have Mudit Mehrotra, who's asking, what is the difference between a data fiduciary and a data processor?
Okay. So let me take an example. Now, suppose I'm a e-commerce business. So for example, let's say I am Amazon.com. In that case, I'm the data fiduciary because the end customer is actually interacting with me as a business, correct? But now, as part of being Amazon, I may actually outsource my shipping services, the way I send packages and so on, right? Now, even a concept of a warehouse itself. So all of that can be outsourced to third parties or different vendors. So in that case, all of these external partners in your supply chain, they become your data processors because you're sharing the customer sensitive data with those partners. For example, if it's a delivery partner, then you're sharing the customer's name, email address, order details. You're sharing the location of that person's, delivery address and so on. So they automatically become a data processor for you. So what we say is that the primary business that you are in, you are a data fiduciary. But then if you're outsourcing any of these services and sharing data to third parties, they become data processors for you.
Understood. I hope that cleared the concept. Thank you so much for that, Vinaya. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. No, I appreciate all these questions coming from the audience. That's very thoughtful. Great. So now coming to the rights and obligations, you'll see one interesting aspect here is that the data principal is the only one who has both rights as well as obligations. Whereas if you look at the data fiduciary, the data processor, the data protection board, consent managers, and so on, right? All of them have only obligations, but no rights. That's a key distinction because, like I said, the data principal being an individual has the right to request for, enterprise to correct the data. They can even actually erase personal data. And you may have actually heard about this before in terms of the, the forget me feature, right? Which under GDPR and CCPA has become broadly very popular. So they can actually come to your business and say, I want you to completely erase my data. Don't even store one record about me, right? So that's the power of the data principal has under the DPDP Act. And they can actually file a grievance as well with the data protection board if there is any violation of their rights. That's extremely significant because think of it like the insurance business, right? So you have the ombudsman from RBI as well for the BFSI sector. Now, what happens is the more the people complain against a particular, say, a bank or an insurer with the ombudsman, there's a reputation risk and so on for that business, market risk, reputation risk, and so on, which is also going to happen with the DPDP Act. If there is any grievance reported by consumers as a violation of their privacy rights. And so it's extremely important for you to ensure that the data principle becomes the center of your business going forward. All of the rights and obligations are actually adhered to. Right? In terms of obligations as well, the data principle also has certain obligations because they cannot impersonate anyone. Right? I cannot go to a business and say, give me somebody else's data. Right? That would be impersonation. So that way, data principle has both rights as well as obligations. And again, coming to the data fiduciary, so your obligations include obtaining consent from the data principal and making sure that you only process that personal data for which the data principal has given consent for, which again is going to be a big challenge for enterprises because we don't collect any of this consent today, right? And now suddenly you have to do this. It doesn't matter what you're collecting about them. You have to tell the data principal upfront that I'm going to collect your email address, your maybe your Aadhaar number, your PAN and whatnot. And what is the purpose for which I'm collecting this data, with whom I'm going to share this data, and for how long. So all of this information has to be presented to the data principal. It's also why, you'll see a lot of, like I say, the news around the DPDP Act, because it's going to be a huge burden for enterprises to suddenly switch gears and, start complying with all of this. Let's say even if you have 6 months to comply with it, it's still going to be a huge burden because you have to implement all of the tools, the systems and processes in place to ensure that all of these are met. And again, like I said, ensuring security of the personal data, which again is something that probably was lax in a world of business. But now you also have to ensure the security of the data that you're collecting. And if there is a data breach, there will definitely be certain frameworks and processes that you have to follow and report to the data protection board. Again, the data processor as well also has obligations because they have to follow all of the instructions from the data fiduciary. For example, if the data fiduciary says that you can store a customer's delivery address only up to the time of delivery and no more, the data processor cannot store the data more than that period. Right? So as soon as the delivery of a package completes, that information has to be deleted by the data processor. Again, it's also going to be a burden on the data processors. And this is where you see the key challenge, right? The entire supply chain has to be compliant with the DPDP Act. And it's actually a big challenge for all businesses now. Okay, so again, we'll also focus on the key principles of for the data fiduciaries because I strongly believe that our audience today will more or less fall in the category of data fiduciaries. So these are the key principles that you have to adhere to, and some of these we have already been discussing. For example, the usage of information that is limited to the purpose of collection. So if I'm capturing personal data about the consumer, then what am I collecting it for and for how long and for what purpose? And then data minimization, which means I have to ensure that I don't collect more data than is necessary. I have to ensure that this data is not duplicated in multiple places. Because the more you duplicate data, it becomes more of a burden to actually meet all of the privacy requirements. The collection of relevant data, storing the data only for a particular duration or fixed duration, no unauthorized collection or processing. Like I said, you cannot collect data about a consumer in the background, right? For example, I cannot embed silent trackers and pixels and silently collect information about them without their consent, right? And accountability lies with the processing or the individual entities, rightful usage of personal information. All of these are very important because I may have collected information from the consumer for a specific purpose, but then I cannot actually use the information for some other purpose. For example, I cannot suddenly start sending, spam emails and communication to the customer because that was not the original intent of collecting that information. So these are the key principles for data fiduciaries. Great. So now we come to the third poll. And again, a very interesting question because given that the DPDP Act was passed into law mid of this year, what we'd like to know from you is, have you actually provisioned for data privacy management tools and software in your IT budget for this year? Because as a standard practice, what we all know is that, budgeting happens at the start of the year, and typically all the IT spend would have happened or, allocated for the next 12 months. Now with the DPDP Act suddenly, jumping into the picture, how are you actually seeing the budget play out? Are you looking to deploy tools within the next 3 months or 6 months, or you have not yet allocated a budget for this? We'd like to know that.
Sure, I think that's going to give us a lot of visibility.
Yeah.
We see a tsunami of questions coming up. That's really encouraging, and I'm really glad the audience is really tuning into this. We're going to take as many questions as possible. Another, again, revisiting the point of a DPO before we discuss this answer. Are there any specific, qualifications or special characteristics that DPOs should possess? And what kind of certifications would be relevant to DPOs?
Got it. So generally, for a DPO, what you would look for is somebody who has broad experience under the gamut of what we call as governance, risk management, and compliance. Right? Because somebody who has dealt with global regulations such as GDPR, CCP, and so on, they probably already have a very good fundamental, tool set to handle the DPDP Act, right? And then you can actually look for certifications from DSCI. You can actually look for certifications from IAPT. So all of these are key certifications that you can look for within a DPO role. Because certifications from IAPP and DSCI are specific to privacy frameworks, processes, and tools. And that's definitely going to add value to your enterprise.
Thank you for that, Vinaya. So the poll results, we see about 6 out of 10 organizations or 6 out of 10 participants say that they haven't yet allocated a budget to specifically address data privacy. Your observations on this, Vinaya?
Absolutely. I mean, you'll see if you just combine the last two, right? So no, we have not allocated a budget, or we plan to deploy privacy tools within the next 6 months. It's a whopping 86%, right? I mean, just imagine how greenfield this area is. People had never thought about privacy before the act, and now they suddenly have to, put all of these things in place. And how do you actually do all of this in a meaningful manner? Again, when you look at privacy, it's not just one area, right? So privacy is actually three pillars. So you have data discovery, data classification, data protection, and data security. And you actually have to invest in each of these areas to comply with the DPDP Act, right? So, and that's why we also wanted to know this, because broadly, this is in line with our understanding of the market as well.
Right. Thank you. Another quick question that I would want to take from the audience, and this one is around if you could just, very briefly explain the implications of the Digital Data Protection Act on one, banks. There are, a few people out here from the BFSI sector who are especially asking with respect to banks and also with respect to healthcare. I would want to chip in with my own question out here, Vinaya. So when we're talking about, data processors being also responsible for your data protection, if you're outsourcing it to a third party,
Correct.
is any lapse from your data processor or that third party also going to impact you? I mean, is there a chance that you will also be facing the 250 crore fine if your third party was at fault?
Correct. Because the ultimate responsibility as defined by the Act lies with the data fiduciary.
Right.
And that's again a big challenge, like I said, right? Not only do you have to comply with your own business, you also have to make sure your third parties are also compliant with the same. And that's going to be a huge burden, right? Because just imagine if I'm dealing with, say, half a dozen third parties, all of whom have access to my consumer data. How do I even get this started?
Right.
With that said, now that we looked at some of the challenges, right, we'll spend some time talking about SEQRITE HawkScan, which is a data privacy management platform. And what I'll talk about in the next few minutes is how HawkScan can actually get you started on the privacy journey. Because while all of the provisions are there, all of those conditions are there under the Act, the fundamental challenge which most enterprises are facing today is that they literally have no idea where personal data is being stored. And just imagine an enterprise that's been in business for 20 years, 30 years, and so on, right? Their IT landscape would be so vast. They would have structured databases, unstructured databases, and then they would have all kinds of file shares, NAS storage, all kinds of endpoints, and so on, right? Nobody knows where personal data is. And again, because with people joining an organization, leaving an organization, tools changing over a period of time, systems, processes all changing over a period of time, literally nobody in the enterprise has an idea what personal data is stored where in the enterprise. And that's the biggest problem. And that's the core problem that HawkScan from SEQRITE targets, right? Because with HawkScan, you actually get a very flexible platform with which you can actually connect all of these data sources. It could be your local file stores, cloud file stores, structured databases, unstructured databases, cloud applications, endpoints, and so on, right? So all of these are automatically scanned by HawkScan, with which we discover and classify personal data, and we tell you what personal data is stored where in the enterprise. Not only that, the biggest power of HawkScan comes in, the concept of the data principle, because everything that we do in HawkScan is centered around the data principle. Let me give you a quick example, right? For example, suppose I'm filling up a loan application for a bank. Then I may be filling out some documents with my personal information. That information is being digitized, and that information is stored maybe on a file server. Now, at the same time, the bank also periodically sends me SMSs and so on, right? Saying that your loan amount is due and whatnot. So my personal information is there in that messaging system as well. Now, what HawkScan does is it connects to all of these data sources. It actually stitches every data principal's profile to give you a 360-degree view, right? So with HawkScan, you can simply quickly create a query saying that, show me all data sources in my enterprise where Vinaya's data is stored or where Soumik's data is stored. And HawkScan will quickly show you a report that says, oh, see, Vinaya's data was stored in this communication system. Vinaya's data was stored in a structured database where we actually employ OCR techniques to classify the data as well. So HawkScan comes with OCR capabilities to handle digitized documents. And in fact, digitized documents is also a key provision in the DPDP Act, right? It specifically talks about documents that have been digitized are also covered under the Act. So with HawkScan's OCR capabilities, you have that covered as well. Essentially, what HawkScan is doing is, in an automated manner and at scale, creating a data principal profile for every individual your business is dealing with. It could be hundreds, thousands, or even millions. All of this happens automatically in the background so that you don't have to do any of this manually. Just imagine the power, right? You just connect your data sources to HawkScan, let HawkScan do its magic, and you have your result sitting there. So as a data protection officer, you're suddenly empowered now because you have all of this information at your fingertips, right? So if a customer comes to you and says, I want you to modify my data, I want you to delete my data or take some other action, you already know where this person's data is, right? And if let's say tomorrow the DPDP Act is refined further and they say that, you have to address this right within 30 days, otherwise there is a penalty. You don't have to worry, right? HawkScan has automatically done that for you. And that's the power of HawkScan, right? So with discovery, classification, labeling, again, you have a very open framework. Earlier, there was a question about, what is personal data? HawkScan actually ships with certain default classifiers, which covers a lot of the categories of personal data. Could be IP address, MAC address, phone number, credit card number, email, whatnot. So HawkScan actually gives you all of these inbuilt classifiers. In addition, you can create your own classifiers as well very easily. It could be something like an employee ID, a policy number, a loan account number, and whatnot, right? Which is very specific to your business. You can actually set up those classifiers in HawkScan as well, and just let HawkScan do its job again. Right? So this way, it's a very open discovery and classification framework, which will actually tailor itself to your enterprise's data dictionary. And that's the power of HawkScan. Again, talking about some of the other key features. So like I said, core feature is to discover and classify data in automated manner and at scale. We give you all kinds of reports. We support OCR classification for digitized documents. You have an option of how you want to deploy, full cloud or hybrid. So both options are available. We also scan endpoints because with the HawkScan agent, you can actually scan your Windows, Linux, or even Mac endpoints, and we'll actually tell you that sensitive data is there on that endpoint. We also give you a lot of inbuilt reports. And probably the biggest advantage is that you can actually, schedule your data source scans, right? Because all of these are typically production databases. You can actually tell HawkScan that, I want you to scan this data source from midnight to 4 a.m. because that's when, the load is not there on the production database. So pretty much HawkScan will adjust itself to your IT infrastructure, right? And it does its magic over there. Great. So with that about HawkScan, I think there's a very important question here, which is that, within an enterprise, have you already identified sources of data, where you store, process, or transmit personal data? And they should include both structured, unstructured, endpoints, and devices. It's simple. Either we do it today or we don't do it today. So that's the poll choice.
Right, absolutely. A couple of questions that we are seeing from the audience. Sure. I'd like to take one from Shekhar Pawar. So Shekhar is asking, how can small and medium enterprises or businesses align themselves with the DPDP Act 2023? That's one thing, because, given the limited resources as well as the budget constraints. Okay. And also, in your point of view, very quickly, what do you think are the, 2 or 3 most important starting points towards DPDP compliance?
Okay. So coming to the first question, I think that's a very important one. And I think there are 2 fronts with which you can attack this problem. One is we are actually seeing the rise of something called as virtual DPOs. Just the way you had the virtual CISO concept, we are seeing that, for small and medium enterprises, there's a concept of virtual DPO, which can be a really quick way for you to get started on the DPDP journey. And then on the other side, what we see is that, you'll have to try to automate all of this as much as possible, right? Because being a small and medium business, you're already constrained for resources and you probably cannot, throw people at this problem, right? Sure. With that said, you then have to actually automate all of these jobs for you so that, you're not putting human power behind this. So pretty much 2 approaches I would take.
Thanks, Vinaya. And I think the poll results are pretty much in line with what you just said and, what I also expected. Almost 3 out of 4 say that, no, we need automated data discovery and classification, which is again something that, a lot of CIOs and CISOs have been saying. They would rather involve that or spend their time in innovations or, business improvement rather than, the mundane tasks of data governance, although it's fairly important. So the topic of automation, could you, talk a little bit more about that? And, how does HawkScan fit in there?
Okay. So like I said, right, this problem is something that, you cannot throw people at this problem.
Right.
But because if you tell somebody to go look at every data source and see where personal data is stored, every endpoint, every file server, every file share, whether it's on-premise or cloud, it's not going to work. Rather, what you need is a tool that can actually automate all of this for you and actually do this on a continuous basis, which is important, right?
Right.
Because privacy compliance is not something you do one time and forget about it. It's something you have to continuously do, right? I have to keep scanning my data sources once every 3 months or once every 6 months. And that's not something, again, like I said, is human addressable. And that's where a tool like HawkScan can actually automate all of this for you, because once you set up the schedules, right? And in fact, in HawkScan, we have very advanced types of scanning as well. We have deep scanning, we have incremental scanning, and so on, right? With deep scanning, your data sources are scanned from top to bottom, and a map of the data source is created. And then with the incremental scanning, we only look at the changes, right? So um, deploying such a tool is actually going to save you a lot and lot of time, money, and effort.
All right. I'll also take a quick question here from
Sure.
Dattatray Patnaik,
Mhm.
who's asking, how does HawkScan dig out data which data principals have already shared with multiple other data fiduciaries, such as banks, or possibly entering their personal details for a lucky draw, etc.?
Okay. So I think what we have to see is that every data principal and mapping to a data fiduciary is unique. For example, let's say if I'm a bank and if a data principal, asks me for what data is stored about that data principal, it is only restricted to my business, because as that bank, I'm not really bothered where else this data is, shared by the data principal with other businesses, unless I'm actually sharing it with my own data processors or the sub processors, right? So as long as the data is in my own supply chain, I have to be bothered about it, and I have to make sure that my supply chain also has these types of tools, built into their IT infrastructure, right? So that is
Mhm.
something you need to take care of, because with your third parties, again, you're not sure where the data is stored. Again, there are lots of interesting things, because your supply chain may not actually be meeting data localization requirements, right? Which is a key requirement of the DPDP Act as well. That data about a resident individual cannot leave the borders of India unless there are, valid agreements in place and so on, which I think will also get detailed as we go through the journey of the Act. But that is something also to be kept in mind. If is your supply chain also localizing the data or not?
Got it. Also, a quick question about HawkScan again.
Mhm.
This one comes from Dixon Almeida. I'll also combine this with a question that Vikram Nirmal had posted earlier. So the question is around, does your software have consent management capability?
Mhm.
And on the same lines, Vikram had asked earlier, is there a matrix for consent?
Okay. So HawkScan today does not provide consent management capabilities, because our core strength is in data discovery and classification. But that is a very interesting point, because HawkScan, we will build connectors into the consent management framework as soon as it is, made clear by the data protection board. For example, should data fiduciaries deploy a consent management tool? And there are worldwide standards for consent management. And in fact, if you look at Google certified list of consent management platforms, you'll see that there are a list of about 20 such consent management platforms, which are best of breed, right? They do consent management very well, and they've been doing it for many years for GDPR, CCP, and so on. And they're actually Google certified as well. So probably you would adopt one of those platforms. And once that platform is in place, we would hook up HawkScan into that consent management framework, which means HawkScan is discovering, classifying data and telling you where personal data is. The consent management platform will tell you what consent is available. So then HawkScan can actually tell you for which data pieces consent is available or is not available. And that is important, because then for the personal data sets where consent is not available, how do you actually handle that going forward? Do you need to take a fresh consent from the consumer? Do you need to delete that? Right. So all of these questions come into place then.
Understood. All right. Thank you, audience, for those questions. Keep them pouring in. We'll move ahead to the next topic. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think probably coming to the end of my presentation, just talking about some of the business benefits of HawkScan. So, like I said, probably the biggest benefit you can get with HawkScan is that you can actually safeguard your organization's reputation, customer trust, and business continuity. Again, like I said, because we make the data principle center of everything that we do, and reputation, trust, and so on is centered around the data principle. We help you link the two, which means you also avoid liabilities due to non-compliance. You can manage all of the subject rights requests with ease, maintain a 360-degree visibility into your data privacy posture. And then again, like I said, you also ensure compliance with multiple privacy regulations. You get to see all of this on a consolidated dashboard. And then the product also comes with the role-based access control so that, you ensure that only specific people in an enterprise have access to the privacy compliance data. And then, like I said, we cover the breadth of your enterprise landscape, endpoints, structured data sources, unstructured, and whatnot. All of those are tied together very easily in HawkScan. And then we integrate with a wide range of data sources. So within HawkScan, we continuously build and launch new connectors depending upon market demand. So if there is a data source that we don't have a connector for, which is very unlikely, we can actually quickly build that connector for you in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So that's how soon we release connectors.
Thank you.
Great. So I think we are up to the final poll of the webinar. So we would like to know if you're actually interested in getting a deep dive of the SEQRITE HawkScan data privacy management solution. So we request you to please indicate your choice.
Right. While we wait for this, for the replies to come through, I was just curious, Vinaya, does SEQRITE offer a kind of a trial period for HawkScan? Can organizations, just give it a drive run before they go on board with it?
Oh, definitely. So by default, we offer a 30-day trial period of HawkScan. So you can actually try the product for free for 30 days. You can actually hook up your own data sources, or you can hook up, test or trial data sources, depending upon your choice. And then you can also choose to deploy the proof of concept or the trial within our premises, or you can do it on our cloud as well. So lots of options available.
Right. Okay. Let's just wait for more audience to answer that particular question, the last one. And we've still got a lot of questions, although we took as many as we could. Now, let's wait for the poll to be completed. We'll close the poll and then we'll dive straight into the remaining questions.
Sure.
All right. I think we got the responses for that poll. Thank you so much for sharing your inputs with us, the audience. Now, from the questions, I see a lot of questions that pertain to the mandatory period. Organizations are required to keep data for. Let's say for banks, they have to keep it for an 8-year period. We have Vikas Sharma, who's also asking us if the government statutory law requires you to keep records for 6 years. And the data principal wants to erase the records because that's again, giving them a right to forget, or giving them the right to not store the data. How is this going to work out with respect to government requiring a certain number of years of data to be stored versus the data principals opting out?
Got it. I think that's an extremely important question. And again, for every data subject rights request that comes in, whether it's for deleting my data and so on, it is not the case that you have to honor every request and blindly delete the data. That's not the expectation. As long as there is a legal intent behind storing that customer data, I mean, it could even be employment records, right? For example, I may have to store employment records for the next 3 years or 5 years, or in a let's say banking case, I may have to store the data for X number of years. Right. As long as there is a legal intent for storing the data, you're actually, good to store the data. You don't have to delete it. And what you would then do is you would respond to that data subject request with the appropriate regulation and details. So you would respond to the customer saying, due to government regulation, so and so, we are mandated to store this legally for the next X number of years. And that's perfectly acceptable, right? All you need to do is you need to ensure that the data principal gets the response in a timely manner. So if, let's say, the data protection board says that responses have to come within 30 days, then you cannot send a response after 60 days, right? That makes the problem more complicated. So as long as you send a valid response to a consumer within that timeline, you are good.
Okay. And the question for you, Vinaya, is what kind of cybersecurity products and tools must enterprises consider when they're embarking on their privacy journey? Also, if you could tell us, how does your product fit into the current requirements?
Sure. So I think broadly, given that, most of the audience attending today has said that they're just getting started on this journey, I'll say that there are probably two topics which are most important. One is data discovery classification and then data loss protection. These are probably the two most important pillars you have to address today. With data discovery classification, you find out where sensitive data or personal data is stored. And with data loss protection, you apply security policies to make sure that the data does not, exfiltrate out of your organization. Somebody cannot copy to a removable drive. Somebody cannot email it without appropriate classification and so on. So that way, data loss protection and discovery classification are the two most important products to implement. So HawkScan helps you with data discovery and classification, and our endpoint security product helps you with data loss protection.
Great. Sounds good. We also have a question coming in from Sanjeev Sharma. I'll also combine it with the one that we had from Sameer Pandya. So Sanjeev is asking us, could you share the comparison with other market tools, for instance, Archer? And we have Sameer who's asking us, is this tool agent-based or can it do agentless discovery as well?
Okay. So let us both questions. Second one first, because much easier to respond to. So we have support both. So for example, when I talked about HawkScan discovering data on an endpoint, it is agent-based. But when I talked about HawkScan discovering data on, say, a SQL database, Microsoft SQL Server, an NTFS file store, Amazon S3 buckets, OneDrive, Outlook, and so on, right? All of that is agentless. So today we support both mechanisms depending upon the data source. And the first question, comparison with Archer, right? So in fact, I myself have broad experience in governance, risk, and compliance, including enterprise risk management and so on. Worked with several GRC tools in the past. So what I'll say is that Archer is more of a integrated risk management platform, IRM as we call it. So there you have multiple aspects like, policy management and governance, supply chain management, vendor governance, third-party risk, enterprise risk management, and so on, right? All higher level aspects of governance, risk, and compliance. But what Archer cannot do is it cannot actually tell you where personal data is stored in which data source, because Archer does not do the lower level part of it, which is data discovery and classification. And definitely there is a use case where the outcomes from HawkScan can actually fit into your ERM framework in Archer. That's definitely an interesting use case.
Sounds good. So I think that would also, serve as a segue into what Anuradha Kannan just asked us. She's asking whether HawkScan complements the existing data classification tools that the customer has. In addition to data classification tools, if you could talk about the integration capabilities with other products that customers might have.
Got it. I think broadly what we are seeing in the market today is that customers would have probably already invested in a data loss protection tool, right? And then that tool is used to a specific way of data being classified, metadata being inserted into file headers and so on, right? And that is something HawkScan supports today. In fact, with our own data loss protection tool, endpoint security, we do that. We also are building connectors into third-party data loss protection platforms as well. And so we'll probably have a follow-up to find out the exact tool that you're using so that we can comment better.
All right. We've got one from Pallab Sarkar who's asking us if the data is encrypted, how would HawkScan work if the data is encrypted, be it, either at rest or in transit?
Okay.
Will HawkScan still be able to, detect the data?
That's a great question, because let me talk about two use cases. For example, let's say you have a Windows endpoint where you're using BitLocker encryption. And now because the BitLocker encryption is part of the operating system itself, and our agent works within the context of that operating system, we'll be able to discover and classify data, no problem. Or if let's say you're using an Amazon S3 drive, where you have actually, used data at rest encryption as well on that S3 bucket. All we need is that the appropriate IAM role be able to do the decryption and, decryption of the data. As long as we have an appropriate IAM role that has the assigned privileges, we'll be able to do data discovery and classification as well over there. So we don't see this as a limitation. Unless, you're using very specific or native encryption protocols, in which case I'll say probably no data classification tool can actually work there. And you're safe because that data is anyway encrypted.
Right. We've got one coming in from Omkar Sankhe who's asking us, does the automated scan introduce any kind of latency or delay while it consumes system resources?
It does not. On the endpoint, it takes minimal footprint. And what we do is we make sure that, our consumption of CPU and RAM and other resources is minimal. On the server side as well, because we have the concept of scheduled scans, any server data source as well, you can just set Hawkscan to scan it during the non-peak hours. Like I said, midnight to 4 a.m. and so on. So we don't even run Hawkscan when the production loads are running. All the flexibility is given to you.
All right. We have one from Arun Sheshanarayana, who's asking us, why not on-premise deployment?
Okay. So in fact, like I said, we have two deployment models. One is where everything is hosted on the SEQRITE AWS cloud in Mumbai. So data localization is met, and that's probably the easiest way to get started. But we also have a hybrid deployment where, so in fact, probably a good time to talk about the way Hawkscan is built internally, right? We have two realms, as we call it. There is a management console and a discovery and classification console. Now, this discovery and classification console is something that you can host fully on premises on your private cloud, wherever you choose to deploy it. Complete flexibility is given to you so that all the data discovery, classification, sensitive data processing, everything stays within your network. And what we do is only the metadata or the locations of that data is shared with the management console, which is on the cloud. So the reason why we do a cloud console is that it's much easier for you to access no matter where you are. But one thing we do ensure is that none of the personal data from that on-premise deployment of the discovery realm ever leaves that boundary, right? Because we don't want to make privacy much bigger problem than it already is for you. And that's something Hawkscan addresses. But we'd be happy to discuss more details in a subsequent call.
All right. Thank you for that. Well, we've still got a lot of questions, but then we'll have to take them offline. We'll try and get back with as many answers to these as possible. Sure. And dear audience, thank you again for your enthusiastic participation. Never seen so many questions pouring in, which again tells us how important a topic this is going to be going forward. And like we promised earlier, we're going to be sharing a link that's going to give you a kind of a guide in PDF format towards DPDP compliance. So can I request the host to actually, put this particular link for everyone there? All right, so we've got a short URL link. So folks, you can click on this link and, access all of this. This gives you pretty much everything you need to know about the DPDPA in one document. We really hope that it's helpful. A lot of you have been asking about the content for this presentation. Well, that's actually up to Vinaya, whether he would want to share it. But then this webinar definitely is going to be available. In a week's time, you can access this webinar on our site on an on-demand basis. So do look out for that. Well, that's pretty much all the time that we had for. And again, a fantastic discussion, really great questions coming in from the audience. And I hope you've enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Thank you again for your time, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you so much, Vinaya, for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.